The Silver Pit. Part 1. The Shaft in the Hills, 1933. This story was told to me by my grandfather when I was a kid, usually when the snow was piling up outside and the wood stove was glowing red. He'd lean back in his chair, take a slow sip of coffee, and say, "You ever hear about the Silver Pit?" Most folks hadn't, but according to him, it was the strangest thing he ever saw in his life. The year was 1933, middle of the Depression. My grandfather was 15 and working bush near Cobalt, Ontario, where silver mines had once made men rich overnight. By the 30s, most of those mines were abandoned, but the land was still full of shafts, tunnels, and rusted machinery. Kids like him spent their free time exploring them. Grandpa and his friends, Ray, Louis, and Frankie, were hauling timber for a small logging outfit that winter. The job paid barely anything, but it kept food on the table. One Saturday, they decided to explore an old ridge locals called Widow's Hill. The place had a reputation. Old miners used to say silver had been pulled out of there before the big boom, but the mine collapsed after an explosion and several men were buried inside. Naturally, that made 4 teenage boys want to find it even more. They followed an old wagon trail through the pines until they spotted something sticking out of the snow. A wooden head frame, crooked and half collapsed, but still standing. Underneath it was a vertical mine shaft about 8 feet wide. Someone had boarded it over long ago with thick timbers. Ray brushed snow off the boards and whistled. "Look at that." One of the planks had been recently moved. The wood was clean where the snow had been pushed aside. Someone had opened the shaft. They pried the board loose and peered down into darkness. A ladder ran down along one side. Frankie grinned. "Well, boys, looks like we're going underground." The air down there was cold and smelled like wet stone. Their lanterns lit up rough wooden beams and narrow tunnels branching off into the rock. It didn't look nearly as collapsed as people said. In fact, it looked maintained. Grandpa said that's the first moment he got a strange feeling. The beams weren't rotten. They were newer wood. After about 10 minutes, they reached a large chamber where the tunnel widened. And that's when they saw the light, a lantern flickering further inside. The boys froze. Someone was definitely down there. They followed the light and stepped into another chamber. There were beds built from planks, shelves full of canned food, a little stove burning coal, and sitting at a rough table was a man sharpening a knife. He looked up slowly. He was tall, thin, with a long gray beard and sharp eyes. He didn't look surprised at all. "Afternoon, boys," he said calmly. The boys stood there awkwardly until Grandpa finally asked, "You live down here?" The man chuckled softly. "Sure do." He introduced himself as Walter, said he'd been living in the mine for years with his family. Just then, 2 teenage girls stepped out of another tunnel carrying a kettle. Behind them came an older woman with pale skin and tired eyes. The girls stared at the boys like they'd never seen strangers before. Walter smiled. "Not many visitors come down here." Grandpa later said something about the whole group looked similar. Same narrow faces, same pale gray eyes, but they were polite enough. Walter insisted the boys stay for supper. They had rabbit stew simmering on the stove, and he brought out a bottle of clear homemade liquor. "Silver miner's medicine," he joked. They ate together while Walter told stories about the old mine. Said silver still ran through the rock if you knew where to look. The stew was delicious. The liquor was strong. Very strong. Too strong. Grandpa remembered feeling warm and dizzy. Ray started laughing at nothing. Frankie leaned back against the wall. The lantern light flickered strangely across the chamber. Walter kept pouring drinks. The girls watched them silently. The older woman never said a word. Grandpa's vision blurred. He tried to stand, but the room tilted. Walter's voice sounded distant. "Best you boys rest a while." The last thing Grandpa remembered was one of the girls taking the lantern from the table. Then darkness. Part 2. The mine that wasn't there. Grandpa woke up freezing. Snow covered his coat. For a moment he thought he'd fallen asleep outside camp. But when he sat up, he realized something strange. They were lying beside a railroad track. Ray and Frankie were nearby, groaning and clutching their heads. Lewis was sitting up already, looking confused. A train whistle blew somewhere far away. They looked around. The sign beside the tracks read, "Haleyberry Station." That was nearly 25 kilometers from Widow's Hill. None of them remembered leaving the mine. A railroad worker walking by stopped when he saw them. "You boys all right?" Grandpa asked him what day it was. "Sunday morning," the man said. They had gone exploring Saturday afternoon. Almost a full day was missing. The boys didn't say much on the walk back. Each of them was trying to make sense of what had happened. When they reached Widow's Hill late that afternoon, the head frame was still there. But something was different. The boards covering the shaft were nailed shut. Old, rusty nails, covered in frost, like they hadn't been moved in years. Ray frowned. "That ain't right." They pried one board loose anyway and looked down. The ladder was gone. Just a deep black hole dropping into darkness. Frankie dropped a rock. It fell for several seconds before they heard it hit water far below. No tunnels, no chamber, no stove, no family. Just an abandoned shaft filled with water. They checked around the hill for another entrance. Nothing. They even asked old miners in town about the silver pit. One man nodded slowly. "Mine collapsed in 1912, he said. "Flooded completely. Nobody's been down there since." Grandpa asked if anyone ever lived in the mine. The old man shook his head. "Impossible. Whole lower levels underwater." The four boys never spoke about it much again. But they all agreed on one thing. The family they met underground was real. The food was real. The liquor was real. And someone had definitely been living in that mine. But here's the strangest part. When Grandpa got home that night, his mother asked where he'd been. He told her he'd been working. She frowned and handed him something. "Weird thing happened earlier," she said. "A man came by looking for you." Grandpa asked what the man looked like. She described a tall, thin man with a gray beard. "Walter." "He left this for you," she said. It was a small chunk of raw silver ore, heavy, shiny. Grandpa kept that piece of silver his entire life, because even though the silver pit was supposedly flooded in 1912, someone down there clearly knew his name. The Ironmouth Mine. In the fall of 1984, there was a place outside the town of Redwater that everyone pretended didn't exist. It wasn't on most maps anymore. The logging companies had moved farther north, the railway spur had been ripped out, and the only thing left was a scar in the hillside where an iron mine used to operate decades earlier. Locals called it Ironmouth, and they said the hills swallowed people. Most adults dismissed it as old mining accidents and small-town superstition. But kids in Redwater knew the stories better than anyone. Something moved down there. And sometimes, late at night, people claimed they could hear metal scraping deep underground. That's what got us interested. There were 5 of us back then: Eric, Lucas, Jamie, Riley, and me. We were 15, bored, and convinced that nothing in the world could actually scare us. Lucas was the one who suggested going to the mine. "My uncle worked there," He told us one night while we were hanging around the hockey rink parking lot. Says there's still tunnels nobody ever mapped. Jamie laughed. Yeah, and ghosts too, right? Lucas shrugged. Maybe. That was enough for us. 2 nights later, we borrowed Riley's brother's old Ford Ranger and drove out past the last houses in Redwater. The road turned to gravel, then dirt, then little more than a trail. The forest got thick fast. Tall black spruce leaned over the road like they were trying to swallow it. After about 20 minutes, the headlights hit something metallic, an old gate. It had once blocked the mine road, but the hinges had rusted away and it hung crooked between 2 posts. A faded sign clung to it. Danger. Mine shafts. Keep out. Lucas hopped out and pushed it open. The hinges shrieked like something alive. Still want to go? Jamie asked. Nobody answered. Instead, we drove through. The road climbed up a rocky hill and then opened into a clearing carved into the side of the mountain. The mine entrance sat there like a wound in the earth. Rusting rails for ore carts disappeared into darkness. Broken wooden beams leaned against the stone walls. An old conveyor belt had collapsed in a pile of twisted metal. The air coming out of the tunnel was cold. Cold enough that you could see your breath. Man, Eric muttered. That's creepy. Lucas grabbed a flashlight from the truck. Let's go. We followed the tracks into the tunnel. The beam of the flashlight bounced off wet stone walls. Water dripped somewhere deeper inside the mine, echoing through the tunnels. The smell was awful. Rotting wood, wet dirt, something metallic. We walked maybe 50 feet before the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. Old equipment sat abandoned everywhere. Carts, cables, broken helmets. Wooden supports creaked every time the wind outside shifted. Riley kicked a rock. His voice echoed when he spoke. Bet nobody's been here in years. Lucas shook his head. No, someone's been here. He pointed his flashlight at the dirt floor. Footprints, fresh ones. We all stared. Jamie laughed nervously. Probably hunters or something. But the prints didn't look like normal boot tracks. They were long, narrow, and deeper at the front, like whatever made them leaned forward when it walked. Eric frowned. That's weird. Lucas kept walking. The tunnel sloped downward. The deeper we went, the colder it got. Soon the air felt thick and damp, like the mine was breathing around us. After another few minutes, the tunnel split into 2 directions. One path was partially collapsed. The other dropped steeply into darkness. Lucas pointed the flashlight down the deeper shaft. Bet that goes to the old lower tunnels. Jamie shook his head immediately. Nope, that's where horror movies go wrong. But Riley was already stepping forward. Come on. We didn't drive all the way out here to turn around. So we followed. The floor became rough rock instead of dirt. Old rails twisted along the ground, half buried in stone. Then we saw the ladder. It was bolted into the rock wall and disappeared down into a vertical shaft. Lucas leaned over the edge and shined his flashlight. The beam didn't reach the bottom. How deep is that? Eric whispered. Lucas grinned. Let's find out. Before anyone could stop him, he started climbing down. One by one, we followed. The ladder groaned with every step. About halfway down, I noticed something scratched into the rock beside the ladder. Old letters, barely visible. Seal this level. My stomach twisted. Guys, I said. But then Lucas's voice echoed from below. Holy crap. We climbed faster. The ladder ended on a stone platform maybe 30 feet underground. The flashlight beam swept across a massive tunnel stretching into darkness. But that wasn't what Lucas was staring at. The tunnel walls were covered in scratches. Hundreds of them. Long gouges carved deep into the rock. like something had been clawing its way through the mine. Jamie swallowed. What the hell made those? Nobody answered. Then we heard it, a sound drifting through the tunnel. At first it just sounded like rocks shifting, but then it came again, slow, heavy, like something dragging itself across stone. Eric whispered, "Tell me that's just the mine settling." Lucas turned off his flashlight. Shh! The sound stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then from deep in the tunnel came a breath, loud, wet, and far too close. Lucas snapped the flashlight back on. The beam shot down the tunnel and caught movement. Something pale slid behind a rock pillar. Tall, too tall to be a person. Jamie grabbed my arm. "We're leaving." No one argued. We rushed for the ladder. Riley started climbing first. Halfway up, he froze. "What?" Eric asked. Riley's voice shook. It's climbing too." I turned. The flashlight beam trembled in Lucas's hand. At the far end of the tunnel, something had stepped into the light. It was thin, unnaturally thin. Its arms hung almost to the ground, fingers long and crooked like broken branches. Its skin looked gray and stretched tight across its bones. But its eyes? They reflected the light like an animal's, and they were locked on us. Lucas whispered, "Move." We scrambled up the ladder. Below us, something grabbed the metal rungs. The entire ladder shook. The sound of claws scraping steel echoed up the shaft. Riley screamed, "Go, go, go!" We climbed faster than we ever had in our lives. The thing followed. Fast, too fast. I could hear it breathing below me, right below me. I didn't look down. I just climbed. At the top, Jamie pulled Riley over the edge. Then Eric, then Lucas. I hauled myself up last. The moment my feet left the ladder, we shoved a rusted ore cart over the shaft opening. Something slammed into the ladder beneath it. The metal rattled violently. For a second, the cart lifted off the ground. Then the noise stopped. Silence filled the mine again. None of us spoke. We ran. All the way back through the tunnels, out past the rails, past the broken equipment, and out into the cold night air. We didn't stop running until we reached the truck. Lucas started the engine and floored it down the dirt road. No one looked back. The next day, we told people what happened. Most of them laughed. Said we'd scared ourselves in an old mine. But a week later, Lucas's uncle came by his house. He had worked at Ironmouth back before it closed. When Lucas told him about the ladder shaft, the scratches, and the thing in the tunnels, the man went pale. Then he said something that none of us have ever forgotten. "The lower levels weren't abandoned because of a collapse," he said quietly. "They sealed them because something started coming up from deeper in the mountain." He paused, then added one last thing. "When they closed the mine, they left 2 men down there." None of us have ever gone back to Ironmouth. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind blows from the hills around Redwater, people say you can still hear metal rattling underground, like something climbing a ladder that leads nowhere. The Silver Ridge Fortune. My great-great-grandfather, Arthur Caldwell, worked at Silver Ridge Mine back in 1912. At least that's what the family story always said. But the older I got, the more I realized he wasn't just a miner. He was clever, quiet, the kind of man who always had a plan nobody else knew about. When I was about 18, my grandfather finally told me the real story. We were sitting in his garage one evening while he sorted through old boxes. Dust floated in the sunlight coming through the window. He pulled out a small tin and opened it. Inside was a folded piece of yellow paper. "Your great-great-granddad left this," he said. I unfolded it carefully. It wasn't a proper map, more like a rough drawing of tunnels, arrows, and a few strange markings. At the bottom was one sentence written in faded ink: "Where the underground river bends beneath the iron arch." I looked up. "What is this?" My grandfather leaned back in his chair. "Before Silver Ridge shut down, Arthur hid something in that mine." "What kind of something?" He smiled slightly. "Silver. Lots of it." According to him, Arthur had spent years secretly setting aside pieces of high-grade ore from the mine. Back then, the place was booming, producing some of the richest silver deposits in the region. Nobody noticed a little bit going missing. Over the years, he refined it into solid bars. Then, right before the mine closed in 1914, he carried it deep into the tunnels and buried it. "Why didn't he go back for it?" I asked. My grandfather shrugged. "The mine collapsed a month later, sealed most of the tunnels. By the time he tried, it was too dangerous." I laughed. "So there's just treasure sitting in an abandoned mine somewhere?" He tapped the map. "According to Arthur, about $6 million worth today." That map sat in my room for about 2 weeks before I showed it to my friends. There were 4 of us: Kyle, Derek, Marcus, and me. Kyle stared at the map like it was the winning lottery ticket. "You realize this could be real?" Marcus laughed. "Or we get stuck in a cave and die like idiots." Derek shrugged. "Worth checking." 2 days later, we loaded into Kyle's lifted pickup truck and drove out toward the mountains. Silver Ridge Mine sat about 40 miles from the nearest town, hidden deep in the forest. The dirt road leading there looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Trees leaned over it, branches scraping the sides of the truck. Finally, we reached a clearing, and there it was. The mine entrance looked like the mouth of a giant cave carved into the hillside. Rusted rail tracks disappeared into the darkness. The old mining buildings had collapsed long ago. Marcus whistled. "Well, this already feels haunted." We grabbed flashlights, rope, and backpacks. Then we stepped inside. The temperature dropped instantly. Cold air poured out of the tunnel like the mountain was breathing. Our footsteps echoed loudly on the old rails as we walked deeper. The map said the first major tunnel split after about 200 feet. Sure enough, we found it. One tunnel curved left, the other sloped downward. The map pointed downward. Kyle grinned. "Here we go." The tunnel got narrower as we descended. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling. About 10 minutes in, we hit the first obstacle. A massive collapse blocked the tunnel. Huge boulders filled the passage. Marcus sighed. "Well, that's the end of the adventure." But Derek pointed to a small gap near the top. "You can climb through that." It took nearly 20 minutes of crawling and squeezing between rocks, but we made it through. On the other side, the tunnel widened again. Then we saw the iron arch. It was an old metal support frame built into the tunnel walls. Rust had eaten through most of it. Kyle pulled out the map. "Where the underground river bends beneath the iron arch." We heard the river before we saw it. A faint rushing sound echoed through the tunnel. Just past the arch, the floor opened into a cavern where water flowed through a narrow channel carved in the rock. The beam of my flashlight caught something strange. A metal box half buried in gravel beside the water. Marcus froze. "No way." We rushed over and started digging around it. The box was heavy, really heavy. It took all 4 of us to drag it out of the gravel. Kyle pried the rusted lid open with a crowbar. Inside were rows of cloth-wrapped bars. Marcus picked one up and peeled back the cloth. Even under decades of tarnish, the metal gleamed. Silver, solid silver bars. And there were dozens of them. Nobody spoke for a full 10 seconds. Then Derek whispered, "Oh my God." Kyle started counting. 30, 40, 50 bars, each one weighing about 20 pounds. Even roughly estimated, it was worth millions. Marcus laughed in disbelief. "Your great-great-granddad was basically a pirate." But right then, the ground shook. A deep rumble echoed through the mine. Dust fell from the ceiling. Then we heard rocks crashing somewhere behind us. "Cave in," Derek yelled. We slammed the lid shut on the box, but the thing weighed over 1,000 pounds. We couldn't carry it. Kyle thought fast. "Take what we can." We stuffed silver bars into our backpacks. Each bag became insanely heavy. Then we ran. The tunnel we came through was still partially open, but more rocks were falling. We climbed over the rubble as fast as we could. Then the ground cracked beneath Marcus. A section of floor collapsed into a deep pit. He barely caught the edge. Kyle grabbed his arm and pulled him up. None of us stopped moving after that. We sprinted through the tunnels until we finally burst out into daylight. We collapsed on the ground outside the mine, breathing hard. Kyle opened his backpack. Inside were 8 silver bars. My bag had 7. Derek had 8. Marcus had 6. 29 bars total, each worth over $200,000. We sat there in complete shock. After getting them professionally verified and sold through collectors, the final total came out to just over $6 million. Split 4 ways, $1.5 million each. Not bad for one stupid idea and an old family map. We never went back for the rest of the treasure, because somewhere deep inside Silver Ridge Mine, there's still a metal box sitting beside an underground river. And judging by how many bars we left behind, there might still be millions more buried down there.